number 3, Ray-McGovern. He was one of the chief morning briefers and analyst, of course, in George Herbert Walker Bush's administration. Also a Army veteran is our guest. I wanted to get him on to talk about WikiLeaks because I've seen him saying, look, this is a big deal. The media is spinning it off into, why did WikiLeaks do this? Should they get in trouble? Instead of looking at what's in these documents and how Afghanistan is unwinnable, at least from the public perspective of what the system claims the war is for. And then we're going to get into Iran. More and more, it looks like they're green-lighting an attack sometime as an October surprise. We'll talk to Ray-McGovern about that as well. Ray, it's always great to have you. Thanks for coming on.
You're most welcome.
WikiLeaks, give us your breakdown on it.
Well, there are a lot of interesting things about it. Substantively, it shows that the war is clearly a misbegotten effort, largely because Pakistan, their security services, the ISI, are supporting the Taliban, funding them, training them, leading them in battle. It's quite remarkable. These Army documents, these are official documents, recognized as authentic by the administration now. They paint a picture of the inter-service intelligence unit there in Pakistan taking the $1 billion that we give them every year and turning it around and making sure that the insurgency prospers, really. And so, this whole business about the border areas, and we need to get the Pakistanis to realize that they need to throw their lot in with us. Well, what really strikes me as bizarre is you get people like our Secretary of State, Hillary-Clinton, goes down to Islamabad and says, now, to the Pakistani leaders, she said, you really shouldn't be afraid of India. I just came from India. They're very nice people there, and they told me they wish you no harm, and so don't be worried about India. Be worried about terrorists. Be worried about Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's what you should worry about. Now, Alex, anybody who knows anything about the history of the subcontinent, it knows that you're not going to be able to persuade the Pakistanis to worry about anybody else but India and vice versa. And so how does this impact on Afghanistan? Well, the way that the Pakistanis ensure or try to ensure that India no longer has a preeminent influence in Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan is to have their own assets. And those assets are ones that they created on our behalf many years ago. They call the Taliban. And they're going to play that card forever. And it's just a matter of time before the feckless counterinsurgency tactics realize that there's an external supply of people and weapons and everything else, just as there was in Vietnam, by the way. When the North kept supplying the troops in the South, so we were going to interdict the supply, right? And we couldn't do that. Then what do? We bomb the North. So what do we do in Pakistan? We're bombing Pakistan, this time with fancy drone stuff where nobody gets shot down or gets killed. Give me a break. It's the most feckless exercise that I've ever seen, and these documents prove it beyond reasonable belief. Now, beyond reasonable doubt, let's say. Now, the White House, 3 days ago, dictated to the stenographers, they call themselves the White House Press Corps, and they all took the dictation, namely, nothing new here. I said, we do all that stuff. We took that into account when we made our big decisions late last year and all this stuff. And so that goes up in the headlines in the Washington Post and the other papers. It's ridiculous. They should read the documents, for Pete's sake, but they're being discouraged to do that. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of back in 2005 when the Downing Street memo was released. Does that sound like we have to break here? If we do...
Yes, sir. Stay there. We're going to come right back. I just didn't want to interrupt you to continue with your view of WikiLeaks, how the media is trying to spin it, what you think these documents are really going to do.
Let me tell you. Listening to The Alex Jones Show.
All right. Former CIA analyst and morning briefer to George Herbert Walker Bush and others. A guy who's really made a lot of accurate predictions and breakdowns here on this show, joins us. We were talking about WikiLeaks and what that means to the Afghan war. In the last year, I've seen all these denials that, oh, there's not advisors, there's not Army and CIA advisors in Pakistan. You know, that's a lie. There's no Blackwater there. Now these documents confirm that, but just in the last week, I guess ahead of these, they came out and admitted, okay, days before this came out, we do have advisors in Pakistan. And it does seem the way they spun this is to point it at Hamid Gul, the former head of Pakistani intelligence, and say, see, we kind of need to be there. But I don't think that's the fault of WikiLeaks, so much of the media just spinning it. But I know Ray McGovern can comment on that. And are there big connections from Pakistani intelligence to the Taliban, and why? And then I want to get into Iran and the war drums really getting more and more intense on that front. But you were cut off by the break, Ray. Please continue.
Sure. I was just trying to raise a comparison here between the WikiLeaks treatment by the fawning corporate media and the way the same fawning corporate media treated the revelations in the after Downing Street minutes. You'll recall that those were minutes recording the chief British spy telling Tony Blair that George Bush had decided to go to war with Iraq for regime change, that this war would be, quote, justified, end quote, by the conjunction of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Translation from the British will say that he has all kinds of weapons of mass destruction and that he's going to use them, give them to terrorists. And finally, that crowning sentence for us intelligence specialists, it went this way, quote, but the intelligence and facts are being fixed around the policy, period, end quote. So that was manifest information, documentary information, the minutes of the meeting written by a participant the same day, and it showed that the intelligence was being fixed. And that was July, the middle of July 2002, some 8 or 9 months before the war. Now, in this case, well, in that case, the New York Times avoided even mentioning it until Representative Conyers held that hearing at which I testified, and 2 mornings before the hearing, he and I were both on Amy Goodman, and that very morning, the Washington Post had published an editorial saying, "Oh yes, and there are these after Downing Street minutes. They are of no consequence. We knew that all the time." I had to laugh because my thought was, if the Washington Post knew that the intelligence was being fixed all the time, yeah, I don't know exactly why they didn't tell us. Can you hazard a guess on that, Alex? So the situation here is the same. They don't want anybody to read them. They don't want anybody to analyze them. And even the New York Times, which was forced to publish this because they knew that the Guardian in London and the Der Spiegel in Hamburg, that they both had them and they would be scooped, and it would be very embarrassing for people to realize that the New York Times had these documents and hadn't published them. So what did they do? They went to the White House and said, we're in this bind. We don't want to be scooped, and is it okay if we can? And, and the White House was very understanding. He said, oh, shucks, I guess this time you can. And Robert Gibbs, the president's spokesman, later complimented the responsible way that the New York Times conducted themselves. I tell you, Alex, if the press has to go to the White House to receive permission to publish things, and that's the responsible way to act, we've come one heck of a long way in the free press of this country.
Do you think this is going to have as much as an effect on the Afghan/Pakistan conflict as the Pentagon Papers with Daniel Ellsberg and the Rand Corporation did to the Vietnam War?
Alex, I've often said that the biggest sea change that I witnessed in this town of Washington in the 47 years I've been here is that there's no longer in any real sense a free press. There was back in the 70s. There was in the 60s. We got rid of a president because of a free press. There is none now. And so it all depends on whether the defunct Fourth Estate has been replaced by a vibrant Fifth Estate. And that's the good news, folks. There's a Fifth Estate out there, a free media. The medium is the ether. It's not susceptible of control by governments or advertisers or corporations which don't own it. And we have the WikiLeaks phenomenon and many other phenomena that feed on the availability of this wonderful resource. And so even though the Fourth Estate is dead, and we should duly mourn it because it's a travesty to have those folks stenographing there in the White House, the Fifth Estate is vibrant. And so I think that if people are given enough information, it's impossible for everybody to read all these Army documents, but if people know where to look for real information on this, and that's the missing link. In speaking around town here, I've been referring often to the Wikileaks exposure of that turkey shoot, that god-awful turkey shoot that our soldiers there in that Apache helicopter gunship, the gun barrel photography, the video on that with sound showing our young people just gloating over the turkey shoot of about a dozen Iraqi civilians minding their own business, severely injuring 2 children. Now, when I ask people about that, nobody knows about it. Maybe out of a very progressive audience of 100 people, 5 people will say, oh, yeah, I read something about that. And only 2 of those have taken the trouble to go up onto their URL line and put in collateral murder. That's all you need, collateral murder.
Now, Ray, we're running out of time. This is key info you've been covering, but we've only got this segment, what's left, and the short segment coming up with you today, and I appreciate the time. But going back to something you just mentioned briefly, now we see cybersecurity. We read about Top Secret USA, 854,000 private individuals with the highest security level. We know they're training the military for domestic operations. The White House admits they want to start censoring the Internet. Cass Sunstein does. And it looks like the system realizes it's not going to get away with all this corruption if they don't start curtailing the web. Are you concerned about that? I
am. And specifically because the general, now 4-star General Keith Alexander, is the same fellow who lied to Congressman Rush Holt, who's on the House Intelligence Committee, and went out there to NSA in December of 2007 and asked Alexander, you're not eavesdropping on American citizens, are you? And he said, oh, no, that's against our first commandment. And James Risen's article came out just a week later. So Alexander, in my day we used to think that Army officers shouldn't lie. Well, he lied to his congressional overseer. That's a crime, okay? And now he is in charge of all this cyberspace stuff, security, offensive stuff, and still head of NSA.
And now the Washington Post says Obama wants to search everybody's computers and ISPs without warrants now, something they're already doing. So we've gone from Bush lying 3 years ago and saying, we're not spying on you without warrants, that's illegal, and to this general doing it, to him now being the head of it and saying, yeah, we're listening to everything you're doing. And Google is in Wired magazine today saying, we're with the CIA, watching all of you in real time. So they've gone from saying, oh, we would never do that, to, yeah, we're watching everything.
You know what the saving grace is here, Alex? The saving grace is that by adding more straw or more hay to the haystack, it makes it even more difficult to find the needles. Now, maybe you and I are getting special treatment, but if you deluge the system with more and more intercepted conversations, just think of the billions and billions of things that they collect every day in NSA. It's funny in terms of them running down patriots like us. It's not so funny when there are real terrorists out there and they can't find this needle in the haystack. Needle in the haystack.
Or corporate criminals. And we've seen that under Bush Sr., Clinton, right through to Obama, where they've cut almost all of the government corporate fraud investigators. 11 years ago, they knew what Madoff was doing but blocked it. Now the Federal Trade Commission's been given total anonymity and immunity for covering up crimes. I mean, this is wild.